There are very few dates that I think most Americans should know, and most of them are pretty obvious. 1776, 1945, 2001. But if you don't already, go ahead and throw the year 1898 somewhere in your subconscious. It is an insanely important year, and it represents a huge turning point in American history. Plus, it'll probably come up at trivia at some point, so. Okay, if you've been following along in our story, we are finally at the moment in American history where we become a capital E empire. And I of course mean that purely for semantics, because as you've seen, if you've watched previous videos, we've been conquering and influencing other nations for almost 100 years at this point. But 1898 is the year when we gain our first colonial territories, with basically no intention of ever turning them into states. And we did it in just 10 weeks. Okay, so the Spanish-American War is called the Cuban War for Independence on the island of Cuba, because Cubans had been rebelling against the Spanish rule for a few decades. And we, the United States, had been paying close attention because the island was just 90 miles from our shores in Florida, and we had been developing an economic relationship for a while now. We also sort of believed that it might be our manifest destiny to go down there and grab that island too at some point. We were so close that Cuban revolutionary Jose Marti set up shop after he was exiled in Florida, where there was already a growing Cuban exile community. While he pushed for Cuban independence, he also warned about the dangers of being scooped up by the US in the chaos, which was pretty smart considering that's almost exactly what happened. Now, Americans were growing increasingly outraged as they read reports of Spanish atrocities in Cuba. And this was toward the end of the Gilded Age when news was becoming its own industry. Like, the idea that you could make money off of the news was fairly new, and I'm sure that won't haunt us for the rest of our history. So-called yellow journalism, pioneered by Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, was sensationalizing stories to drum up readers. It was basically clickbait. After the USS Maine, a US battleship anchored in Havana Harbor, mysteriously exploded, newspapers and the American public lost their minds. In hindsight, it most likely was a mechanical failure, but there was really no way to know that at the time. And reports circulated that the Spanish had destroyed our ship and killed our sailors, and Americans demanded we go to war. One of those Americans was none other than Theodore Roosevelt. He had moved up from police commissioner of New York to assistant secretary of the Navy. And Teddy has been super into boats for like his entire life. As a Harvard student, he researched and then published the preeminent text on the Naval War of 1812. Like, he's a bona fide boat nerd, which meant he was instrumental in pushing us to war with Spain, partly as a way to give our new naval ships some real-world practice. That was actually one of the main reasons he advocated entering the war. Since he was just assistant secretary to the Navy, this happened much to the chagrin of his boss, who felt like Teddy was overstepping. I mean, yeah, that's just what Teddy does. But, possibly because he was quite annoying, Teddy's boss was more than happy to release him so that he could help organize the first US volunteer cavalry. Teddy sorted through 23,000 applications to form the Rough Riders. With this now famous ragtag group of polo players, hunters, cowboys, Native Americans, and college athletes, Teddy went to Cuba. They made a name for themselves at the Battle of San Juan Heights, mostly thanks to Teddy himself writing reports of his heroics and sending them back to be published in the news. How very Julius Caesar of him. His knack for publicity is going to make him one of the most famous celebrities of the war, and the Spanish-American War is going to propel him into national politics. Now, Teddy's publicity to the contrary, the war itself was not much to write home about. It lasted a little over 2 months, the US never experienced a reversal in its positions, and most of the Spanish soldiers died of disease. But the outcome of the Spanish-American War was enormously important for US history. At the end of the war, Spain surrendered its last colonial territories, ending its era of Spanish imperialism, and the US acquired control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So let's just run through what happened with each of these territories after the war. First up, Puerto Rico. I mean, I did an entire podcast episode on Puerto Rico, so you can check it out for a deep dive, but in general, Puerto Rico became a US territory and then we just never let it go. Over time, they developed some rights, like today, Puerto Ricans are US citizens who pay some taxes, but not others. They can vote in the presidential primaries, but not the election. They have a representative in Congress, but she can't vote on anything. They're in this weird limbo. And since the beginning, the question has been, what do we do with Puerto Rico? We're still asking ourselves that question. The US also gained control of and still have Guam. Guam is a Pacific island that's 210 square miles. For reference, that's about 2/3 the size of New York City. It became an important stopover earlier on for Spanish Manila galleons, huge ships filled with silver from the New World headed to the Philippines to be traded with Asia. Similarly, the US has come to value Guam as a station for American merchant and warships, especially into the 20th century as our interests in Asia and the Pacific increased. As of 1952, those born in Guam are also US citizens, even though the island is still listed as one of 17 non-self-governing territories by the UN. Fun fact, its unofficial motto is "Where America's Day Begins," since it's the westernmost part of the US territory and the closest to the international dateline. Now, the two other territories we gained control over were much more contentious at the time. First, the debate over what to do with the Philippines raged in Congress for years, and the rest of the world was watching to see what the United States would do. For example, Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, First World Problems, White People Problems, The White Man's Burden, was written expressly for an American audience. Like, the full title of the poem is The White Man's Burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands. English imperialism superfan, Kipling wrote the poem to convince the US to take up the burden that the English had been carrying in Asia and Africa, and help them civilize places like the Philippines. And although at first the Filipinos viewed the US as an important ally to help them win their independence from Spain, they quickly realized that we might have ulterior motives. Just 1 year after the Spanish-American War ended, the Philippine War of Independence began in 1899. Similar to Cuba, the Filipinos viewed the Spanish-American War just as the last stage of their own revolution for independence, and they were not happy that the US swooped in at the last minute to control the aftermath. You see, in 1898, Congress had determined that the Philippines were far too important as an economic and military base near East Asia to give up. The US believed it couldn't risk another country jumping in, like Japan or Germany, both nations that were starting to increase their influence in the Pacific. Foreshadowing. And the US also believed that the Filipinos were not advanced or civilized enough to rule themselves. Remember that this is the era of scientific racism, when Western nations believed themselves to be superior to non-white people, and thus justified in conquering them. Not just justified, but a lot of white people believed the conquered nation should be thankful that white men would take on the burden of civilizing and saving the souls of people of color around the world. Oof. Now, one of my favorite acts of resistance in world history is that of Emilio Aguinaldo. He was the leader of the Filipino independence movement, and he wrote a beautiful letter to the American people, pleading with them to sympathize with his cause. This letter is a masterclass in persuasive writing, and it's an amazing document to discuss intended audience. Now, let's read some parts of it. He wrote, "God Almighty knows how unjust is the war which the imperial arms have provoked and are maintaining against our unfortunate country. If the honest American patriots could understand the sad truth of this declaration, we are sure they would, without the least delay, stop this unspeakable horror." Basically, I know you Americans are all good Christian people, and once I tell you how terrible this is, I know that you'll do the right thing and allow us to be independent, right? Quote, "The Spanish government, whose despotic cruelty American imperialism now imitates, and in some respects surpasses, denied to us many of the liberties which you were already enjoying when, under pretext of oppression, you revolted against British domination." There's nothing I love more than when people call upon a historical irony in a document. Because I'm a nerd. Aguinaldo is saying that not only are we worse than the Spanish, who we fought to liberate the Filipinos from, but we're also treating the Filipinos worse than the Americans were being treated by the British when we started our revolution. And finally, why do the imperialists wish to subjugate us? What do they intend to do with us? Do they expect us to surrender, to yield our inalienable rights, our homes, our properties, our lives, our future destinies to the absolute control of the United States? What would you do with our 9 millions of people? Would you permit us to take part in your elections? Would you concede to us the privilege of sending senators and representatives to your Congress? Would you allow us to erect one or more federal states? Or would you tax us without representation? Would you change your tariff laws so as to admit our products free of duty and in competition with the products of our own soil? Here he makes possibly his strongest argument, because Aguinaldo is getting to the heart of the problem with American imperialism. We can't decide whether we're okay with it or not. How can we call ourselves the land of the free and a beacon of democracy if we start taking colonies? It's a true moral dilemma that the US is forced to consider, especially in the few years after 1898. Congress goes back and forth trying to figure out what to do with places like the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, because up until this point, we've just annexed our new territory, but this is different. For one, we've always been able to portray ourselves as better than the European empires, but also, we didn't really want all the cost and logistical problems that come with overseas colonies. We kind of just want the benefits, right? If you would just trade with us and promise to be loyal to us, this would be a lot easier for us. For 15 years, the Filipino people fought against the U.S. occupation of the islands, but by the end, they remained a U.S. territory. Besides over 200,000 Filipino casualties during the war, the Roman Catholic Church was removed as the state religion, and English was introduced as the primary language. It wouldn't be until after World War II and a brutal occupation by Japan that the U.S. would finally grant the Philippines independence. Finally, Cuba, the island that got us into this war to begin with. So Congress only approved McKinley's declaration of war as long as the president promised that Cuba would remain independent after the war was over. The US was joining the war to support Cuba's bid for independence from Spain and nothing more. Except there was a lot more. Cuba is kind of a perfect case study for understanding more creative types of imperialism. Because although the government kept its promise, we very firmly guided the Cuban independence process. With our military. Our military stayed on the island until Cuba wrote its new constitution, and we stuck around until they had included an attachment on their founding document known as the Platt Amendment. This did a few things. The Cuban government would not enter into any international treaty with another country that would compromise its independence or allow foreign powers to use the island for military purposes. Well, except for the US, because the US specifically reserved the right to intervene in Cuban affairs in order to defend Cuban independence. Wait, if we intervene, then wouldn't we be jeopardizing the very independence we claim to protect? Stop overthinking, Emily. It's imperialism. It makes no sense. Cuba would commit to a government that protected life, property, and individual liberty. Notice the order there. US sugar companies are like, yeah, it goes life, property, then rights and freedom and blah, 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 blah. And Cuba would agree to sell or lease territory for coaling and naval stations to the US. Yada, 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 Guantanamo Bay. So why did Cuba agree to this, even though it clearly limited their sovereignty? Well, again, our military was there. But also, we promised them a trade treaty that would guarantee Cuban sugar exports access to US markets. Notice, both Hawaii and Cuba are following a similar pattern of the US using access to its growing economy, shout out Gilded Age, as the carrot to encourage them to join our economic sphere of influence. Of course, in both instances, we also have a stick that we can wield, like marine intervention, coups, etc., if we really need to. So even though the Cuban people repeatedly tried to reject or modify the Platt Amendment, in the end, it was ratified in 1901, and our military went home. Ah, democracy. Not for long. Our military would go on to reoccupy the island of Cuba twice in the next 20 years, both times to protect economic interests during political turmoil. During the second occupation, nicknamed the Sugar Intervention, the Marines literally guarded infrastructure crucial to sugar processing, setting up camps around the countryside for 5 years. This supervision or intimidation, whichever you want to call it, led to record sugar harvests, mostly exported to the United States. Now, both sides agreed to abolish the Platt Amendment in 1934. Like, spoiler alert, we had a depression to worry about. But at that point, the Cuban economy was already really closely tied to the United States. And let's be honest, if they had tried to stray out of our shadow and make new allies or develop a government that was in any way not what we wanted, well, those of you who listen to season 1 of my podcast know what happens to Latin American countries that go left. Look out. So after 1898, the United States was clearly an empire. No more semantics about expansion or annexation or destiny. And for the most part, white Americans were pretty happy about it. Keep in mind that this is at the height of Western imperialism, spreading civilization and Christianity while also complaining about their white man's burden. Many in the West believed that the only way to have a competitive industrial economy was to have colonies, much in the same way that many had believed that the only way to compete in the cash crop economy was to use slave labor. It's not a justification, but it is an explanation. However, as we saw with slavery, there were plenty of people at the time who saw the dark side of imperialism. Most prominently in the US, the American Anti-Imperialist League formed just a few weeks after the US entered the Spanish-American War, calling the war imperialism camouflaged as a war of liberation. I mean, they weren't wrong. And if you want to read an amazingly sassy poem, go check out the satirical response to Rudyard Kipling's famous poem. This one is called The Real White Man's Burden, and the basic message is Western civilization isn't all that great. Why are we forcing the rest of the world to accept a life filled with pollution and poverty, corruption, banks, and tricky politicians? You know, classic Gilded Age stuff. It's really a great document, and you should read it with as much sarcasm as you can muster. But for now, imperialism is the name of the game, and you should notice that at this point, we have developed our playbook for involving ourselves in foreign affairs throughout the 20th century. Push trade agreements. If that doesn't work, claim the current government isn't democratic and put pressure on them to accept our pre-written reforms. And if all else fails, send in the Marines. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.